Most people spend their lives trying to feel only the right emotions. Joy is welcome. Calm is welcome. Confidence is welcome. But sadness, anger, embarrassment after a mistake, those feelings are usually pushed away as quickly as possible. And yet, something curious happens when we try to control our emotions this way. The feelings we resist rarely disappear. In fact, they often return louder, heavier, and at the worst possible moments. What if peace doesn't come from choosing which emotions you feel? What if real calm begins the moment you stop fighting your feelings and learn to welcome them like temporary visitors? In this story, you'll meet a man who spent years trying to keep certain emotions locked outside the door of his life, until one quiet encounter revealed a simple truth that changed everything. A truth so simple that most people overlook it, yet powerful enough to bring a surprising sense of peace to even the busiest, most restless mind. Let's begin with a small wooden door and the knocks that refused to go away. On a quiet afternoon, a young man named Elias sat beside a small wooden door in his cottage, fingers resting on the old brass handle. Outside, faint knocking came and went like distant rain. Some knocks were gentle, almost polite. Others were heavier, impatient, as if someone stood there shifting their weight. Elias preferred the soft ones. The harsh knocks made his shoulders tense. For years he had tried to manage the visitors outside that door. Joy and excitement were welcome guests, of course, and he'd open the door quickly for them. But sadness, anger, embarrassment, well, those visitors made the room feel smaller. So Elias learned a little trick. If he kept the door closed long enough, maybe they'd wander away. At first it seemed to work. The cottage stayed quiet, almost too quiet. Yet something strange happened after a while. The knocking didn't disappear. It grew louder. Sometimes it came all at once. Several fists tapping, pounding, rattling the hinges. Elias would press his back against the door, breathing slowly, hoping the visitors would lose interest. Oddly enough, the more he tried to choose which guests could enter, the more restless the cottage felt. Even the sunlight through the window seemed unsure of itself. A pleasant moment could suddenly turn heavy, like a room filled with air before a storm. Elias often wondered, with a tired sigh, why peace felt so fragile. One evening, the knocking returned again, a mix of soft taps and stubborn thuds. Elias sat on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees, staring at the handle, and a small, unsettling thought drifted through his mind. Perhaps the problem wasn't the visitors outside, but the door he kept trying to control. The knocking continued, steady now, almost patient, and somewhere beyond the cottage path, someone who understood doors very well was quietly approaching. The next morning, the knocking returned before the sun had fully warmed the hills. Elias was already awake, sitting near the little wooden door with a cup of tea cooling beside him. He listened carefully this time. The sounds were familiar now, soft taps, uncertain knocks, and occasionally a heavier thud that made the hinges tremble just a little. He had spent so long deciding which visitors deserved entry that he had almost forgotten something simple. Visitors, by their nature, rarely stay forever. Even the most talkative guest eventually stands, stretches, and walks back out into the world. Yet Elias had been guarding the door as if every knock meant someone intended to move in permanently. A quiet realization began forming, the way morning light slowly fills a room. Perhaps these knocks were not demands but messages. Perhaps sadness knocked only to be noticed. Perhaps anger knocked simply to be heard. If that were true, then holding the door shut might actually keep them lingering longer outside. He placed his hand on the handle for a moment, not opening it yet, just feeling the cool metal under his palm. The knocking softened slightly, almost as if the visitors sensed they had been acknowledged. Elias tilted his head, curious. It was a strange thought, but a comforting one. Maybe peace wasn't about choosing which feelings could arrive. Maybe peace came from letting them arrive, and trusting they would eventually leave on their own. Elias didn't know it yet, but someone nearby had already learned this quiet secret long ago. Elias hadn't always been so cautious with the little wooden door. Years ago, he used to swing it open without much thought, letting whatever arrived drift through the cottage like a passing breeze. But somewhere along the way, a few visitors had stayed longer than he liked. Sadness once lingered for days. Anger had knocked so loudly that the whole house seemed to shake. After that, Elias made a quiet decision. Some guests were simply not welcome anymore. He became careful, almost watchful. Whenever a knock carried the tone of disappointment, rejection, or shame, he'd tighten his jaw and pretend he hadn't heard it. "Not today," he'd murmur softly, as if the visitors outside could understand. At first, this strategy seemed clever. The cottage looked peaceful from the outside, and Elias even convinced himself it felt lighter inside. But gradually something else began to grow in the silence. The rooms felt dull, like a song played without melody. Even Joy, when it arrived, didn't stay long. It seemed confused by the stillness. Stranger still, the knocking never truly stopped. Some evenings, Elias would feel the pressure behind the door without hearing a sound at all. His chest would tighten after a careless comment from someone. A memory would drift in after a small mistake. The door remained closed, but the weight of those visitors somehow seeped through the wood. And deep down, Elias carried a quiet fear he never said aloud. If he opened the door to sadness or anger even once, what if they rushed in and never left? He didn't realize that the answer to that fear was already walking slowly along the dusty path toward his cottage. That afternoon, the knocking changed. It was no longer scattered and uncertain. Now it came in waves. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. Like visitors patiently reminding Elias they were still there. The little wooden door trembled slightly each time, and the brass handle rattled with a faint metallic sigh. Elias leaned his forehead against the door and listened. On the other side, he imagined a crowd gathering quietly along the cottage path. Sadness might be standing there with folded arms. Frustration could be pacing back and forth. Perhaps embarrassment lingered near the steps, unsure whether to knock again or simply leave. The door itself seemed to carry the tension. Its wood creaked as if holding its breath. The hinges strained just enough to whisper their protest. Elias suddenly noticed how much effort it took to keep it closed, not only with his hands, but with his whole body, his thoughts, even the tight rhythm of his breathing. It was a strange realization. The door wasn't just protecting him from the visitors. It was also trapping their presence right outside, pressing quietly against the cottage walls. The more he resisted, the more crowded the path seemed to become. Elias stepped back and studied the door carefully. It was a simple thing: old wood, a brass handle, 2 patient hinges. Yet it had somehow become the center of his entire inner world. And just as another firm knock echoed through the cottage, a soft voice from the garden said gently, "Doors grow heavier when they are never opened." Elias turned toward the garden window, surprised by the calmness in the voice. Outside stood an older man leaning lightly against the wooden fence, as if he had been there for a while. His posture was relaxed, almost playful, like someone watching clouds drift rather than problems unfold. The stranger didn't rush or gesture dramatically. He simply looked at the cottage door and smiled with quiet familiarity. "Ah," he said softly, brushing a bit of dust from his sleeve. "That door has been busy today." Elias blinked, unsure how someone could speak about the knocking with such ease. "You can hear them too?" Elias asked cautiously. The man nodded, not with seriousness, but with the calm acceptance of someone greeting old acquaintances. "Of course," he replied. "Visitors like these travel everywhere. They knocked on my door this morning as well." Elias studied the man carefully. There was something unusual about him. The older man didn't seem tense or guarded, even though the knocking continued steadily behind Elias. Instead, he stood there with the quiet steadiness of someone who had learned to live peacefully with such sounds. "Don't they bother you?" Elias asked. The man chuckled gently, a warm sound like dry leaves shifting in the wind. "Only when I pretend they shouldn't be there," he said. "Strangely enough, when you welcome them for a moment, they become much quieter guests." Elias glanced back at the trembling door, unsure whether to believe him. But the old man had already begun walking slowly toward the cottage steps, as though he knew exactly what that door was meant to teach. The old man stepped into the cottage slowly, as if entering a place he already understood. The knocking behind the wooden door continued, steady, patient, almost rhythmic now. Elias watched him carefully, expecting the man to look uneasy. But the mentor simply placed a hand gently on the door, like greeting an old friend. "Listen closely," the man said softly. They both stood still for a moment. The knocks no longer sounded threatening. Up close, they felt more like signals than intrusions. Elias noticed something curious. The moment the man acknowledged the door, the pounding seemed to soften slightly. "You've been guarding this door as if every visitor wants to stay forever," the mentor said. His voice carried the warmth of someone explaining a simple truth. But feelings are travelers. They knock, they step inside for a moment, and then they move along their way. The man slowly turned the handle just a fraction. Not enough to open it fully, only enough to let a thin breeze slip through the frame. Elias felt the shift immediately. The air inside the cottage moved again, light and natural, as if the room had been waiting for this tiny act of courage. "You see," the mentor continued gently, "peace isn't built by locking the door tighter. It comes from knowing you can open it and trust that the guests will leave when their message has been heard." Elias watched the door quietly, his heartbeat calmer now. For the first time, the knocking didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation to understand something he had avoided for a very long time. The next knock came softly, almost shy, as if testing whether the cottage had changed. Elias stood near the door, hands resting loosely at his sides. The mentor sat by the window, watching the light move across the wooden floor. No one rushed the moment. Elias took a slow breath and placed his hand on the brass handle again. This time he didn't brace himself against the door. He simply turned the handle and opened it a small distance. A quiet gust of cool air slipped inside, carrying the feeling that had been waiting outside. Something like sadness, gentle but heavy. For a moment, Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, but instead of pushing it away, he paused. Just one breath, then another. The mentor nodded slightly from across the room, as if to say, "Yes, that's enough." And strangely, the feeling inside Elias shifted almost immediately. It didn't flood the cottage the way he had feared. It moved through like a passing cloud. The air softened. The room felt clearer, as if something had finally been allowed to stretch its legs before continuing its journey. Over the next few days, more visitors came. Frustration knocked after a sharp comment from a neighbor. Embarrassment appeared when Elias dropped a basket in the market. Each time, he practiced the same quiet ritual. Pause, breathe once or twice, and open the door just enough. Little by little, the cottage grew lighter, and Elias began to notice that the path outside the door looked far less crowded than before. A few days later, Elias walked through the small village market with a basket of apples resting on his arm. The morning air carried the smell of bread and fresh herbs, and for a while, everything felt calm. But just as he reached the corner stall, a neighbor muttered something sharp about his clumsiness from the week before. The words landed heavier than Elias expected. For a brief second, the old reaction stirred inside him, anger knocking loudly, embarrassment tapping right behind it. He could almost feel the familiar urge to slam the door again, to shut everything down before it could be felt. Instead, Elias paused beside the stall. He didn't say anything yet. He simply placed his hand lightly against his chest and took one slow breath, then another. In his mind, he imagined the small wooden door back at the cottage. The knocking was there again. Anger, hurt, a little sting of shame. But this time he didn't wrestle with them. He pictured himself opening the door just enough for the visitors to step through the room. The feelings moved gently inside him, and just as the mentor had promised, they didn't stay long. When Elias finally spoke to the neighbor, his voice carried none of the sharp edges he once feared. It was calm, almost steady, like someone who had quietly tidied a room before welcoming a guest. And as he continued walking through the market, Elias realized something surprising. The door inside him no longer felt like something he had to guard. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the hills, Elias returned to the cottage with the quiet satisfaction of a simple day. The mentor was sitting on the wooden step outside, watching the sky shift from gold to soft blue. The little door rested calmly behind them, its handle glowing faintly in the warm light. "Most people think peace is complicated," the mentor said, almost to the wind itself. Elias sat beside him, listening. "But often it begins with something very small, just noticing what is knocking." Elias tilted his head. The mentor picked up a tiny pebble from the ground and placed it in Elias's palm. "Imagine each feeling is like a knock at the door," he said gently. "When one arrives, pause for a moment. You don't have to fix it. Just say quietly to yourself, 'This feeling is allowed.'" Elias closed his eyes for a moment, trying it. A faint ripple of worry appeared from something he had been thinking about earlier. Instead of pushing it away, he pictured the little door opening slightly. He took one slow breath, then another, letting the feeling move through like air through a window. The pebble in his hand suddenly felt lighter, not because the feeling vanished instantly, but because it was no longer something he had to fight. The mentor smiled softly, watching the quiet settle around them. And somewhere in that peaceful evening, Elias began to understand what the open door truly meant. Several days later, the cottage felt different in a way Elias couldn't easily explain. The little wooden door still stood in the same place, its brass handle worn smooth from years of cautious hands. Yet the air inside the room seemed wider now, as if the walls themselves had relaxed. Visitors still came, of course. One morning, disappointment knocked after a letter brought unwelcome news. Later that afternoon, a small wave of loneliness tapped quietly while the rain brushed against the windows. But Elias no longer rushed to brace the door. Instead, he followed the gentle rhythm he had learned. A pause, a breath, sometimes two. Then the handle turned. The door opened just enough, and the visitor stepped through the cottage, like a traveler passing along a familiar road. The surprising part was how ordinary it began to feel. Feelings no longer stormed the house like invaders. They entered, shared their quiet presence, and continued on their way. The cottage remained steady, not empty of emotion, but balanced within it. One evening, Elias sat beside the open door as the last light of day stretched across the floorboards. Outside, the path was calm, and the breeze moved freely between the garden and the room. For the first time in years, he realized something simple and powerful. Peace had never meant living in a house with no visitors. It meant living in a house where the door could open freely, and where every guest knew they were welcome to arrive, stay briefly, and gently leave again.